Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, running a sharp program here. Welcome to this panel on the environmental security aspect of Russia's war in Ukraine. My name is Shannon O'Lear. I am a professor of geography in the Geography and Atmospheric Science Department here at the University of Kansas. I'm also the director of the Environmental Studies program. And way back when KU brought me here, I was also up to my eyeballs in work in the South Caucasus, which I still sort of dabble in a little bit here and there. So that is my role here as the moderator, but I'd like to introduce to you our bright panel of speakers today. To my immediate right, we have Dr. Kurt Preston, who recently joined the University of Kansas as professor of practice. Previously, he was a program manager for both the Department of Defense Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program and the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. Earlier in his career, he served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, where he also served as the university's Export Control Officer. At the same time, he was a member of the Chief of Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board. He holds a bachelor's degree in agronomy soil science from the University of Georgia, a master's degree and doctorate in environmental engineering from Purdue University, and a Juris Doctorate from North Carolina Central University. Dr. Preston is a retired lieutenant colonel with previous assignments in Europe, South America, and the Middle East. In the middle of our panel, we have Dr. Kristina Hook, who is an assistant professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State's University School of Conflict Management, Peacebuilding, and Development. She's an anthropologist and scholar practitioner specializing in civilian protection and human security. Dr. Hook is an expert on the Russia-Ukraine war, where her work focuses on the identity, technological, and environmental ramifications of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. A former Fulbright scholar to Ukraine, she has conducted multiple years of fieldwork in Ukraine since 2015 and is writing a book on the Ukrainian Holodomor, or genocide. Dr. Hook received her joint PhD in anthropology and peace studies from the University of Notre Dame's Department of Anthropology and Kroc Institute for International Studies. She's the principal author of a 2023 report titled The Russian Federation's Escalating Commission of Genocide in Ukraine, a Legal Analysis. And finally, all the way from Kansas State University, I'm very pleased to present Dr. Antonina Broyaka, who has a PhD in economics and is associate professor from Ukraine. From 1998 to 2022, she carried out scientific and educational activities at the Vinnytsia National Agrarian University. She served as Associate Dean for Research and later as a Dean for the Faculty of Economics and Entrepreneurship. In her research, she focuses on the development of the agro-industrial sector, agricultural extension service, food security, grain markets, and agricultural foreign trade. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, she found refuge in the US. She's continuing her research as an extension associate of the Agricultural Economics Department at Kansas State University. Her work focuses on the economic impact of Russian military aggression on Ukrainian agriculture, grain markets, and global food security. Now, our starting point are the questions laid out for this panel. Although they may have other plans, they've been asked to comment on these two questions. How has the war affected the environment of Ukraine and the Black Sea region? And how can the environmental impact of the war be addressed by Ukraine and the international community? So we've asked each panelist to talk for about 15 minutes, but I figure that schedule is probably going to have to go with the flow of the morning. So take it away, Dr. Preston.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm truly honored to be here. As was mentioned, recently came on the board, or came on board here at KU from the Department of Defense, where I, back in this past January, concluded about a 33-year career, which was remarkably interesting in that it the career kind of patterned or kind of followed the development of environmental security as a concept within the Department of Defense. And so I'm humbled to be on the panel here, because largely my experience has been through practice of working this intersection between environment and national security from a Department of Defense and principally Army perspective. Before coming on board, I worked with Dr. Kate White, who is the program director for climate change at the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for installations and environment. And so I dual track my career through, on the one side, being a military officer, mostly in the reserves, first 5 years on active duty, but then also as a civilian environmental engineer, both here in the United States and also in Europe. And what that provided was, the Army in particular, the opportunity was, if they needed me in a uniform, poof, I would become, depending on the arc of my career, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, Preston, and then 40 hours a week. And my normal role was in the, for example, was in Europe as the director of environmental programs at USER when it was in Heidelberg. So it's been this real interesting road that's kind of paralleled the concepts of environmental security. The concept itself is not new. In the 93 to 2001 timeframe, we had a deputy undersecretary of defense for environmental security. What has always been somewhat of a challenge has been defining it. Is what is this thing that we call environmental security? So prior to this meeting, I have a very close colleague up at the Naval War College who is extraordinarily focused and schooled on this. And I asked her, I said, hey, what is the latest permutations of environmental security definitions? And to show kind of the amorphous characteristics of it, I get 3 definitions back that were, but from 3 different communities. One community being the OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense Policy. They have a group that I was involved in called the Resource Competition, Environmental Security and Stabilization, or RECESS group. One from the intelligence community, they have an environmental security working group. And then one from one of the more active combatant commands in environmental security regime, which is Indo-PACOM. I won't go into all 3 of them. I will share with you the RECESS definition, which is environmental security is defined as security challenges and opportunities arising from changes in the environment at local, regional, and global scales. Environmental security includes, but is not limited to, you like the kind of amorphous, it's kind of like big data, right? It's hard to, everybody knows it when they see it. That's a definition for another, from Supreme Court anyway. Is not limited to water, food, energy, climate, health, ecological security, and interconnections between these systems. My little definition is a Venn diagram. You have environmental issues on one side, you have national security issues, and where those 2 intersect, you get this thing called environmental security. So what I'd like to do very quickly is share with you 3 vignettes. And in putting together the thoughts, I got this out of the library, wonderful book, Environmental Geopolitics by someone, Shannon O'Lear. Oh my goodness. But I used a framework that is resonant in the book, considering embodiment, lived experience, practice, action, and behaviors, and then materiality, physical, tangible things. And then what we like to do in the military a lot is, you think about tactical, operational, and strategic scales. And so the first vignette really comes from an early part of environmental security when I was called back to active duty to be Major Preston and the environmental engineer in the former Yugoslavia in the early days of the institution of the Dayton Accords. Operation Joint Endeavor was brought there very much in response to vestiges that came out of the end of the Cold War. As the we were using a Hungarian airbase slash Soviet airbase, former, in southern Hungary, outside the city of Kaposvár, as our forward staging base for U.S. forces heading into Bosnia. If you're moving large military forces, there's three things you look for: 10,000-foot runway, a railroad line, and highway access. And it just so happens that's where those three things came together. So that was our forward staging base. The Hungarians were more than happy to lease those facilities to us for our operation, except for one key element. They were not going to have the environment damaged the way it had been by the former occupants of that airbase. In particular, there had been railroad cars with jet fuel that could have been like sold on the open market, given the Hungarians, taken back maybe with the country who was responsible for it. And long story short, they opened the stopcocks on the tank cars and just poured the fuel into a very shallow aquifer that fed the drinking water of the local community. One of the larger impacts in that area of Hungary. So long story short, the call came back and said, by gosh, we got to have an environmental engineer who's involved in the operation. So hence, I was the environmental engineer for the implementation force in 95 and early 96. Had 4 programs. And so now we're at the tactical level, right? Now we're down where, where you have captains and major Prestons running around. And there were 4 programs. There was a hazardous waste management program. So, people think large military operation, exotic stuff. It's not. It's batteries, it's fuel, it's how to manage those materials in a appropriate manner. Spill response, you get that many tank trucks running around, you're going to have one turnover. And then field expedient remediation. And then a 4th pillar was the assessment of sites that we were going into and those coming out. That was done principally, frankly, for the Army Claims Service. So that if we went into a site and there was a later claim that, well, 2 reasons: one, human health; the other was potential future claims, that we would have what it looked like when we came in and what we looked at when it came out, in documentation. So that was the materiality. The physical thing was this environmental program. That's what an environmental program looks like in a military operation, and that was in the early, as an example, kind of a tactical level of environmental security. One of the benefits from that was twofold. One, I had the opportunity to be on Hungarian radio, which was kind of a treat for a major. The second was when there were surveys done of public opinion, actually the closer a community was to the base, the more confidence they had in how we were working with the environment. It was in other parts of Hungary where there would be issues raised of, what are the Americans doing? But the closer you got, the more the local community appreciated. And actually, over time, we developed very good relations with the Hungarian military. It started with good ones, but even got better. Let's go to the operational vignette very quickly. This one's going to be focused internally to the United States. And the lived experience is the hurricanes of Michael and Florence. And the point I'm making there is that from climate change, we have seen impacts of Eglin Air Force Base impact for Michael was $5 billion. Florence, Camp Lejeune was $3.6 billion. As a result, the Department of Congress basically came to the Department of Defense and said, hey, what's our risk? And the thing I want to share with you is there's the adaptation plans from climate change that the Department of Defense is focused on. Either adaptation, which is basically, do we move, or how do we adjust our systems, or resilience, which is, okay, we're not going to move, how do we make it an installation or a facility be able to withstand? The point I'm making is the Department of Defense is globally distributed and somewhat locally managed. And so we have to develop policies to support that. Currently there is a Defense Climate Assessment Tool, and I'll get to the international link on that in a moment. And there's also Defense Regional Sea Level Rise. So coastal installations globally, we have scenario-driven sea level information out until the end of the century. The international link is that the Defense Climate Assessment Tool actually has been shared with partner nations so that they can do assessments of what their climate change environmental risk is into the future. And finally, the third vignette is more at the strategic level. And this vignette has to do with the environmental security discussions. Environmental security, we were talking about tools for engagement. For a long time, and it's come back, the Defense Environmental International Cooperation Program. And what these tools for engagement were focused on discussions with host nation military. So it's a military to military discussions on preserving on the environmental issues that run in that seam between military and the broader environment. The environmental security conferences under the Partnership for Peace program was an active engagement with the satellite states of the former Soviet Union as they were transitioning into their current state within NATO. Now we're talking the late 90s, early 2000s. And it was a way for us to engage the newly emerging states, military to military, on a topic that was not sensitive in the sense of, how many troops do you have? Before they were really willing to train with us. Of course, now they're part of NATO. But the early discussions, we shared a common problem, and that was formerly used defense sites. And so how they clean up after the Cold War. And so there's opportunities for this tool for discussions between militaries on environmental issues. Those opportunities are still going in a very strategic, important part of the world. Indo-PACOM has a very active environmental security program called IPEF, in which they engage with island nations throughout the Pacific Basin. So long story short, 3 vignettes trying to portray to you the engagement of the Department of Defense with broadly the environmental security issues. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Kristina.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to go after such a great presentation and to be on this panel. So I'm here to give a little bit of the lay of the land. And the lay of the land in Ukraine is that we are working with territorially the largest country in Europe with a very entrenched aggressor. And so that means that I really could use my 15 minutes just going through a laundry list of damage, but that's not really the most productive way for us to spend this time. So what I'd like to suggest in terms of giving the lay of the land, what's going on in Ukraine, what I've seen in my work there doing environmental research over the last 9 years, and what that should mean to us now are 3 different questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about these categories of layers of environmental impact. This is the question where we say, what's going on? What are the connections between these spheres? The second question is, who are we up against? What's Russia's intent with the environmental damage that's going on? What does that tell us about perpetrator logic? And then also, finally, let's talk about recovery. The so what? What should we do now? So many of you will be very familiar with the map of Ukraine, but just in case, I want to point out that it's an older map. It's from February 2023, but I purposefully used it because I wanted to point out that something that's become very, very important for our talk of the environment is actually not even on this map. So I think that this is telling you one thing right away, which is how quickly the situation can evolve. And I'm, of course, referring to the Kakhovka Dam, which is in Kherson here in the south. The dam itself is not on the map. Kherson is. I also wanted to use this map to kind of show you this theme of interconnection that's going to be throughout a lot of the things I'm going to talk about. And that also we see physically in the map just by looking at the waterways of how the nature and the resources flow in this area. Now, as promised, impacts. I promised you 3 things to talk about. Thank you. I promised you 3 things to talk about, and I'm slightly breaking my promise by breaking the first one down. It's the only one I'll do, I promise. But what I want to talk about with impact are 3 different things: the arena of impact, the stage on which the environment is being damaged, the time frame, and the victims. So right away, just talking about what I'm going to call arenas of impact, just helping us think really carefully about the interconnection of the nature and the landscape that we live on in this world, and specifically that Ukraine finds itself, the state of affairs today. So Russia's war has done a variety of damage, which I told you I was going to restrain myself from just spitting a laundry list at you. But just a few things: the natural landscape of this expansive territory. We have forests, woodlands, fields, grasslands. We have Ukraine's famous steppe. We also have Ukrainian biodiversity, especially in places in the south. Ukraine had an indigenous zebra population, which is sort of a fun fact I pull out at parties. And this is also an area that was impacted by the flooding of the Kakhovka Dam. So it really has this rich bioheritage. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is damage that I'm going to call the sort of flashy media damage, and then other things as well. So I pulled this picture. I was thinking about our colleague Volodymyr, who just spoke, who's from Odessa. This is a picture of Russian missiles striking a storage facility that was holding petroleum products. And so this is what we might see in the news, these plumes. We can think about chemicals, we can think about particulates. And we might also see this bottom picture in the news, this terrible damage that Russia is doing that floods people out of their homes. But there's also more subtle damage going on, and that's this middle picture, which again is from Ukraine, but some of the folks in the room might recognize it from other zones of conflict. And that's what I'll call the subtle damage of, chemicals that can leach into the soil, tires that can be abandoned in sites if the battle moves on. These are all parts of the environmental arena that's happening. And this, of course, affects soil, water, air. I also put this word urban to remind myself to talk about the really unique nature of this war, because Ukraine is so heavily urbanized. It's heavily industrialized as well. My work on environmental issues began in Ukraine in the Donbas region, which was very industrialized, and where Ukraine lost control of part of its territory. And what that meant was flooding of these mines were not able to happen with the Russia-controlled side. And you can want to control that flooding, but you've got to have 2 to tango on issues of flooding and letting that water go down. And so that's something that we've seen for a long time in Ukraine. And then also energy. So I had an early start to my morning because Russia was again really escalating its targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure that also has real environmental impacts. Moving quickly, as promised, my colleague and I, when we talk about environmental impacts in Ukraine, we try to talk about this framework of what we call risk exposure, and that's the dose and time model. So we want to think about short-term vulnerabilities, which I'll come back to, and we also want to think about long-term risks. Now, there's a lot of us Americans in this room, and so I think probably like me, many of us, we're aware of some of the health impacts that firefighters have had after 9/11. They were responding to these buildings that were destroyed, and that had long-term health impacts for them. This photo is from Ukraine, and they are also facing similar things on unfortunately a larger scale, things like asbestos and other what we might think of as the subtle damage. Every time I look at yet another Ukrainian apartment building, especially the older ones that have had missiles go through them, my first thought is about the people in the rubble, and my second thought is about asbestos, about the nature of the rubble itself. Where's that going to go? In a kind of good case scenario, that rubble goes to a landfill. In a bad case scenario, that rubble can end up in the forest. It can even end up in streams. And then also it's important to think about environmental impact with the short term. And this is where it gets quite sad. And I think to me, it connects with the perpetrator logic that we're up against, because The short-term environmental damage is damage of a bully, because the short-term damage affects those who are most vulnerable right up front. You might think about the younger, healthy population in Ukraine. They may have long-term health impacts like cancer or respiratory illnesses. There are real reasons why going forward, the health reconstruction and the environmental recovery are going to go hand in hand for the long-term risks. But for the short term, this is usually the very young or the very old, or people who are infirm in other ways. And so a short-term risk that I can tell you about is an infant. His name was Amir. He lived in Kharkiv, and in the spring of 2022, right away, his parents had to take this very young boy into cold bomb shelters. He was exposed to a lot of particulate matter, and he'd been born with some lung issues. So his family was able to move to Western Ukraine right away in the spring of 2022, but Amir died almost immediately after his family arrived in Western Ukraine. They had gotten him to a place of physical safety, but his body was not able to cope with some of the environmental harm that he had been exposed to. So I am going to move very quickly through this because we're really in for a treat. We're going to get to sit and talk specifically about agriculture next. But I want to also mention that environmental harm done intentionally also happens on sites of pre-existing vulnerability. So this map right here is the explosive ordnance contamination, more or less. And you can also see though how some of these areas map on to the soil degradation map from 2021. Now here in the east, this is a Russian-controlled area. There was industrial conflict, kinetic warfare-related issues happening there. And Crimea, another occupied part of Ukraine, was having conflict-related water issues. But the rest of this map is actually showing us things of the soil erosion that was caused by things like water and wind for a variety of reasons. And so for someone like me, I grew up on the Gulf Coast of Florida. So some names like Ivan or Katrina mean something very specific to me about hurricanes. And in those moments when disaster has struck, you wish it has never happened, but it has happened. And so what do? How do you think about rebuilding? And so this is some of the ways that Ukraine will think about rebuilding, not just physically constructing some of what was there, but also thinking about sites of pre-existing vulnerability in the environmental area, and how this can be an opportunity that you never wish was handed to you, but an opportunity nonetheless to not just build back what was there, but to also try to build in some of this environmental remediation. And so finally, just the victims, just thinking in a complex way about the victims of environmental harm in Ukraine. So first of all, it's the biodiversity that I told you about. Ukraine also had the largest desert on the European continent, which was interesting, and also the animals. This is unfortunately the dolphin population in the Black Sea for reasons that have to do with kinetic warfare, as well as probably some of that chemical flow have been found washing up. And I also want to think about, Ukrainians as victims of environmental harm in a couple different ways, not just the terrible health impacts that I talked about, but also the ways that this affects the economy. I'm going to zoom through that because we have that up next, but also things like identity. So I consider myself very lucky to have lived in Ukraine for multiple years now. And, we lived in Kyiv, which is a very tech-forward urban area. Lots of sophisticated urbanites, but even for us, sometimes we would go on the weekend and pick mushrooms in the forest or things like that, where you would just sort of relax with your friends in these natural areas. Now those areas have landmines. I had a friend, I just got back from Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and I had a friend say that she was no longer volunteering to walk dogs at the shelter. She was working more with cats. And I asked her why. And she said that, some of the paths where they used to walk dogs have not fully been cleared by landmines. And so she's just not quite mentally up for walking dogs in the places where she used to, because she's worried that either she or the dog will stray off that path. That is a way that the environment is also impacting mental health. And then also the world. I'm going to, again, zoom through food security because I know we're coming back to it, but that's a key area, that this is, again, a way that environmental harm is going to hurt not just the most vulnerable in Ukraine, but globally, as we're seeing. Waterways, air pollution, they don't respect national sovereignty. And so figuring out what we're going to do. And also I take really seriously, and I agree with General Breedlove's point about Russia always wanting us to think about nuclear issues. to deter us. But I think we've also got to flip that coin and think about nefarious actors, not just other states, but also non-state actors and what they think about Russia controlling the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. That's a site where there are things that there could be a real environmental disaster, but a disaster with a lot of other security implications. So intent, what I think is really important when we think about the environment and warfare is, first of all, to recognize, and this is a direct quote from a colleague of mine at Ukraine's Ministry of Environmental Resources, is it's a little hard for everyone to think about the particulates in the air when the air is also filled with missiles. Point taken, right? Like that's a very fair point. But what that does to us subtly is it can also cause us to think about the environment as kind of, passive or collateral damage. And we know that that's part of the environmental story in warfare, that things do happen to the environment. The emission from all of these, heavy equipment that I'm personally thrilled that I see going into Ukraine, those also have emissions, things like that. But there's also a way that we need to look at environmental harm and look at the environment itself as a targeted victim when that also makes sense. And this is a case where that does make sense to think about. And so I put up this term ecocide, which has really come into be in the news more and more because it's a push by many in Ukraine and in broader environmental spheres to not just call the entire case of environmental damage, but to call specific things like the Russian destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, to say that's not just negligence, that's criminality. And so this language of what is intentional destruction is not only talking to us about perpetrator logics, but also it's going to shape our way that we move forward in really profound ways. And I thought this would be a good conference to bring it up because this is also about the Russia-Ukraine war and the world. Now, we can't retroactively go back and prosecute a new crime, which this would be in a case like this. So actually, I think that there's a lot of political generosity by those in Ukraine who are trying to raise this issue of ecocide, recognizing that this case that is driving many of their interests might not have its day in court under that specific statute. But other cases would, not wanting other people in the world to go through this as part of that. My colleague and I have been working on this issue of how do we organize the chaos of environmental harm. My colleague is also, my background is with the State Department before I became an academic. My colleague, also an academic, his background is with the Marine Corps. And so we're bringing together this kind of applied lens too with how we've done environmental work in Ukraine. And we've looked at the environment as a trigger. If there's competition over resources, does that trigger conflict? I think in Ukraine, we wouldn't call it the primary trigger, but this also helps us to understand some of the industrial scale looting that we're seeing of the Russians in Ukraine. We can also look at the environment as neglected. I'm going to skip down. This one breaks my heart a little bit because Ukraine had really very interesting and really relatively robust environmental management of nuclear heritage fragile sites in the east before they literally were pushed out of control of those areas. That can lead to degradation, both intentional and unintentional. And then finally to the environment itself as a mechanism of control. So circling back to that point, we have seen the Russians use the environment as a mechanism control. And what I think of is two separate ways. So I've talked about the Kakhovka Dam. That's taking something and targeting a human intervention into their environment and unleashing all of this water. That's striking at a way that humans have modified their environment and their ecosystem for good or for bad. We've also seen the Russians, including last night, but also really in a striking way in the winter of 2022 and 2023, try to use the cold itself as part of their arsenal of weapons against Ukraine. And so I'm referring to the nationwide missile strikes that began in the winter of 2022 that led to 2 international criminal courts indictments of Russian military actors. And that is really accelerating over the last month or so in Ukraine. That's an attempt to, especially in that winter campaign, to use the cold itself, to use an environmental feature of Ukraine's landscape to reduce the built landscape aspect of places in Ukraine and to use the cold itself as a tool of destruction. So depressing, yes. But having come back from Ukraine just a few weeks ago, I also want to wrap up my remarks as promised, because as we talked about, our main competition on this panel is lunch, and we take that very seriously. But I do want to just mention a couple things that I know are going on in Ukraine that I hope we can talk more about, and that's recovery. So this picture is an Odessa-based vet. He and his wife are vets. They specialize in exotic animals, but with the war affecting a lot of pets, this is him wading through some of that water to rescue these kittens that were trapped there. And he and his wife have actually talked about the continuing health impacts that they're having because of the Kakhovka Dam flooding. There were many, many chemicals in that water. This is a Ukrainian scientist who kind of faces her own fears. I really respect her, and heads to these places of impact right away to take soil samples. And so what, with all of this, ingenuity and expertise, what should we focus on? And hopefully I'm not blocking my own slide here. I'll bring the mic down, but there are 4 things that I'm really looking at, areas of recovery that actions are happening and that I think they'll continue. The first is Ukraine really is, I think, a case where green energy and energy diversification is a first order national security impact for Ukraine. So it's understanding that a lot of the ways of generating electricity are big buildings that then Russia is targeting now and that we expect them to target in the future. So Ukraine is really looking at lots of different energy alternatives, a very complex energy generation system as a part of their first order national security interests. We're also seeing reconstruction, and this is where we have to face and do what we can to mitigate some of the unavoidable environmental impacts of the rebuilding processes that will happen in the future and that are happening now in Ukraine. Reconstruction will take emissions, so we need to be asking questions about if there are ways that we can mitigate or monitor that as Ukraine experiences reconstruction. The second one, city planning. So it's not just about rebuilding places in Ukraine that were destroyed, but it's also about figuring out the new demographic landscape of Ukraine, because so many places have been razed to the ground in the east and some in the south as well. So we're seeing an upsurge in populations in cities like Lviv or Vinnytsia in central Ukraine. And I put wastewater here because I know, for example, I love Lviv. It's a very beautiful city. It also wasn't expecting as a city to host and home as many people as it is right now. And so currently the wastewater system in Lviv is overrun because the population has grown so fast. So it's not always just about reconstruction. It's also about city planning and thinking through the environmental impacts of that. And then finally, innovation, this question of rubble. This is you've done it. This is my last slide, but I did want to tell you 2 really interesting things that are happening. So I wanted to put up Echo Action. This is a Ukrainian organization because they do a lot of really interesting work on green energy and reconstruction, and they have an English website. So I'd Echo Action. This is them in Ukrainian, but you can read more on their website. And this is also Neo Echo, another organization who's done some really interesting work in the Kyiv region or in Mykolaiv, which is in the south. And this, I think, to me shows this overlapping reality of the environment and the people that live on it, because what they're doing is involving the community and involving veterans who are no longer able to serve in the military due to injuries in these processes to reclaim rubble and to turn that into usable materials for Ukraine's reconstruction now. And it's fascinating because this is a company that also has international experts working, and they said, in other places in Europe, we'd go into a building and strip it really carefully and figure out how to reduce, reuse, and reclaim materials. When we show up at a building in Ukraine, it's basically a big pile of rubble on the floor. And even there, working together, they found these innovative methodologies where they're actually able to reuse 90% of the rubble that they found in Ukraine, and to get that rubble certified as strong enough concrete that it actually has the highest safety certification, which means that 90% of this rubble can be safely certified, reused in bridges, apartment buildings, and places like that. And so, what I've often said is we don't right now have all the technological solutions that we'll need for dealing with that. But if I had to, place a wager on a society that was really good at innovating, I would place that bet on Ukraine. And so, as we sort of face this compounding harm, as we work to stop it, where Russia intended to destroy, like, let us innovate. This is my email. I'll pop it up really quickly if anyone would like to stay in touch, and I will turn the mic over to my colleague. Thank you.
Oops. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, KU, for inviting. It's a big honor for me to be here since this topic is very important to me personally. I'm Ukrainian, I'm from Ukraine, and I came here to protect my children after the war started in Ukraine. And my slides gonna be very busy since I'm agricultural economist and it's gonna be full of numbers. And if you are interested to have it, you are very welcome. We can share that. So I'm going to cover the impact of the war on environment of Ukraine and international communities through the lens of agriculture. Agricultural production significantly depends from many natural resources such as soil, water, biological materials, and sufficient level of agricultural production and trade is a guarantee for food security. So agricultural sector was always the main driver of the Ukrainian economy, making up the largest share of Ukrainian GDP. Before the war, it was more than 10%. In 2022, due to the war, Ukrainian GDP decreased by almost 30%. However, the share of agriculture in GDP was still the largest, over 8%. In 2023, despite the war, GDP of Ukraine increased by 5.3%. And actually, agricultural sector, in particular, grain production and export, ensured this growth. So Ukrainian agriculture remained the most important branch that filled the budget of Ukraine, feeds Ukrainians and many other nations. Ukraine is known as a breadbasket of the world. Although it declines in some types of agricultural export, Ukraine still keeps leading position in the world. Ukraine remains first on sunflower oil and meal market, and we also became first in sunflower seed export. Currently, we are third on rapeseed market, fourth on corn market, and fifth on barley market, and sixth on soybean market and wheat market. Even our share decreased. In 2023, I'm sorry that it's kind of low. In 2023, agricultural export was less for almost $6 billion. However, the share of agricultural export in the total export of Ukraine increased to 62% from 41% in 2021. Traditionally, maintaining leadership in state budget revenue and becoming the maximum since the independence of Ukraine from the US. So as you can see, Ukrainian agriculture, keeping Ukrainian agriculture moving, that is very extremely important task as for Ukraine, as for the rest of the world in terms of food security. Russian war brought to Ukraine a lot of deaths and damage, and total amount of direct documented damages caused to Ukraine's infrastructure due to the war was reached $156 billion at replacement cost. That is as of February 2024. The housing stock remained in first place in terms of damage. 100,000 families lost their houses both in cities and rural areas. Total damage to the agricultural sector amounted $10.3 billion, forest $4.5 billion, and there is a separated category which is way below, that is ecology, amounted to $16.4 billion, which includes environmental damage calculated as damage from air emission due to military equipment and war-related pollution, and that is not direct damage to real estate. But the total economic loss amounted to around $500 billion, including $70 billion for agriculture due to disruption to economic flows and production and additional costs accounted with the war. So the largest category in agricultural damages is destroyed and stolen agricultural machineries and equipment, which amounted to $5.8 billion or 56.7% of total. About 181,000 units of agricultural machinery and equipment were partially damaged, stolen, or completely damaged due to invasion. 11.3 million tons of storage facilities, grain storage facilities, are fully destroyed, and another 3.3 million tons are partially damaged due to the invasion, resulting totally in $1.8 billion. At least 2.8 million tons of grain and 1.2 million tons of oil seeds are considered damaged or stolen, which actually doesn't include harvested grain by Russia on occupied territories of Ukraine. We heard about hundreds thousand people killed, but also Ukraine lost a lot of animals. In total, the war has led to the loss of 238,000 heads of cattle, 544,000 heads of pigs, 131,000 heads of sheep and goats, and almost 13 million heads of poultry. If we look at the distribution of damages, of course, regions that are under active hostilities suffer the most, especially Kherson and Zaporizhia region after Kakhovka dam explosion. Besides direct damages, there are also 70 billion of indirect losses to agriculture, namely foregone revenue due to lower production, reduced prices, and increased production cost. The most significant category of losses is caused by lower annual crop production, including 48.6 million ton reduction in grain production and 8.7 million ton reduction in sunflower production. The main reason is lower cultivation areas due to the loss of territories and lower yields due to war-induced changes in production technologies. The second largest category of losses results from decrease in domestic prices, totaling 24.1 billion, or nearly 35% of all losses. Export disruption due to naval blockade imposed by Russia significantly complicated logistics for Ukrainian agricultural export, increasing logistic costs, and also at the same time reducing demand and prices for agricultural commodities in the domestic market. Unlike damages which are located in the areas affected by the ground battle, losses affect agribusinesses all over Ukraine. So total damages and losses to Ukrainian agriculture amounted $80 billion. The restoration of Ukrainian agricultural industry is a long process that depends on many factors, in particular the attraction of investment and financing, the stability of export routes, and the introduction of new progressive agricultural practices. According to the latest estimates made by the World Bank in collaboration with the United Nations and Ukrainian government, the total recovery reconstruction needs in agricultural sector exceeded $56 billion that need to be made over 10 years, including $435 million for 2024. Recovery measures focuses on completing reconstruction or replacement of war-damaged assets while accommodating the Build Back Better principle, supporting a long-term recovery in line with the European Green Deal requirements, investment in agricultural public institutions for delivery sufficient agricultural and rural development policy and agricultural services. There is a separate project for Kakhovka Dam reconstruction worth $180 million, but it cannot be done before liberation of Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast. Cleaning of mines is estimated separately. The current total cost for clearance of explosive subject across Ukraine is $34.6 billion, among which roughly $15 billion are needed to demine agricultural land. During 2023, Ukrainian sappers, with help of foreign companies, also including the US companies, examined 274,000 hectares of agricultural land. This is 58% actually of what was planned to be done in 4 years, and that is good results. However, it will take decades to demine all our land, and this is the full map of the demining, the latest one that is from Ukrainian defense website. Unfortunately, Ukraine, which has the most fertile soil in the world, currently is the most heavily mined country in the world. It estimates that more than a third of Ukrainian territory is potentially contaminated with explosive subject as a result of the invasion in 2022. And especially the areas along front line are heavily contaminated, and clearance effort where there will be complex, costly, and time-consuming, requiring applications of the highest technical standards. Mined land pose a constant threat to human life and also prevent the restoration of agriculture. And as I mentioned, it will take decades to demine and return land to cultivation, to agriculture. Another issue is how to keep the fertility of rich Ukrainian soil on those territories that are located in relatively safe part of Ukraine. Import logistics for inputs such as fuel, fertilizer, plant protected products has also been a big challenge. Input prices spiked in 2022 following Russian invasion. In 2023, the situation kind of stabilized, but prices had declined slightly, and yet they did not reach the pre-war level. As a result, the application of fertilizers and chemicals have significantly reduced. Of course, lower application rates allowed farmers to reduce the cost and decrease their losses. However, this leads to the loss of soil fertility and quality of the harvest. As a result of Russian invasion, annual crop acreage declined for over 30%. If in 2021, Ukraine harvested 15.3 million hectares, in 2023, we were able to harvest only 10.3 million hectares. Totally, in 2023, we harvested around 59 million tons of grain and legumes. Corn actually remained the most problematic crop for the second year in a row. Instead of harvesting it by November, many farmers were forced to leave it on field until spring due to the shortage of fuel and electricity, which is needed for drying grain before storing. However, due to high fertility of Ukrainian land and favorable weather conditions, the average yield in 2023 were much higher than in 2022, and for some crops even higher than in 2021, but we do not expect this next year, 2024. Winter crops traditionally prevail in grain crop structure. Here is the final result for winter planting campaign for 2024 harvest. This year, we planted winter crops on area of 5.9 million hectares, which is 34% less than in pre-war year, but 9% more than in 2022. 200 hectares less of winter wheat planted as expected. It is 10% more than in 2022, but still 36% less than in 2021, and this is our main crop, right? So, which means that our next harvest is going to be lower. Spring campaign just started, so it's too early to make final estimates, but we expect to plant around 5.6 million hectares of grain crops, which is 26% less than in pre-war level. And we plant over 7 million hectares of oil crop, which is going to be 500,000 hectares more than in 2021. This switch is related to the problems with corn harvesting and smaller losses from production of oil crops compared to grain crops. Totally, we expect to plant spring crops 2% more than in previous season, but it's still totally 16% less than in 2021. So, I just mentioned that harvest in 2023 was better than in 2022. However, it's much smaller compared to our pre-war level, and you can see this by different cultures that we produce. This year, we harvested 29.5 million tons of corn. This is 12 million tons less than in 2021. The outlook for 2024 is 26.3 million tons. We harvested 23.4 million tons of wheat this year, 10 million tons less than in 2021. Next season, we expect 20 million tons. We harvested 14.5 million tons of sunflower seeds, less than for 2.5 million tons. And we expect in 2024, 13.7 million tons. So what does it mean for Ukraine and for international community? Our losses will continue to grow. Our export will decrease. It will be still enough to feed ourselves, but many countries which are import dependent will not receive grain from Ukraine. With limited agricultural production and export logistics, Ukrainian agriculture will remain unprofitable. And I'm not sure how long brave Ukrainian farmers can keep it moving, having no profits year by year. So totally, Ukraine is finishing the season 2023 with 82 million tons of grain and oil seeds. In 23, we exported 53 million tons of grain, and you can see this dynamic, how it changed. And for next year, we estimate lower harvest amounted to 76 million tons and respectively lower export, 43 million tons, 10 million tons less. So I know we are not competing with lunch, but today we spoke a little bit about logistics and port infrastructure. I do not really agree with previous speakers that we are on our current capacity, of our previous capacity. We never reached that level, pre-war level, and this is how much we exported in last months of 2021 before the war started. And you can see the war started at the end of February, and since March to August, when United Grain Initiative was started with help of Turkey, the export from Ukraine was very, very low, right? And we needed to find other alternative routes, especially through Europe, and also using our capacity as much as possible of the new river ports. And that is tiny river ports that never been used almost before the war. So then you can see Grain Initiative, and that is was kind of better and worse months, and that was related to all the time Russian inspectors tried to stop Ukrainian export from Ukrainian ports till it was terminated in July 23. Then you can see that it was no any export from Odessa ports. And I want just to remind that that is just 3 big Odessa ports. And before the war, we had 18 ports on the coast. So now with opening of Ukrainian humanitarian corridor, which we opened just not only moving agricultural export, but help to evacuate vessels that were stuck in the ports before the war. before 2022, because during grain initiative, we were allowed to move out of Ukraine only grain, right? But that was a lot of other products that we wanted to export and also a lot of other vessels that were stuck there. So that was started as an idea of evacuating, and then we forced Russian fleet to leave our coast, and now we can see increase, but we're still way behind our capacity. So actually, these issues with export logistics really hit geographical infrastructure, geographical structure of our grain export. And if you can see, before the war, China, Egypt, and Indonesia were our main importer, but then a lot of countries, including Asian and African countries, were not able to get grain from Ukraine, right? And that raised huge issue of food security for those countries. Instead, you can see a lot of European countries that appeared on the top list of Ukrainian grain importers, and that was forced solution because we needed some help. Usually Europe is our competitor on a grain market, but under war circumstances, they were open to help us, and they eliminated trade tariffs and also allowed us for free trade. But their market became very soon oversaturated with Ukrainian grain, and then following this, 5 European countries introduced a ban on agricultural export from Ukraine. So as a result, we can see that then all those countries not any longer buy grain from Ukraine unless for transit. And among them, Spain, which the only one country that increases import from Ukraine because they have direct access to the ocean, right? But this actually made additional pressure on world prices because this grain goes for re-export, right? And make this more expensive for import-dependent countries. So concluding, I would like to mention that one of the ideas of Russian war in Ukraine that is using food as a weapon. And they spread this to those import-dependent countries and use this to blackmail them and force them to just play their game. Thank you.
Okay, I am completely confident that we will be able to answer all of our questions that we all have in the next 17 minutes. I scribbled up a couple of questions that I have, but I think I would be interested to take just go straight to questions from the folks in the room. If anybody would like to field a question for anybody at the panel, they can take it. Yes. Oh, hold on a second. Yep. You have a microphone coming to you.
Thank you all for your presentation. I'm an assistant professor at the School for Advanced Military Studies just up the road in Leavenworth. And I was interested in the question of the last presenter, Mr. Broyaka, regarding just maybe some clarification. I looked at your last slide and it stated or showed that China had decreased its purchase, and that was it a decrease in purchase, or was it a decrease in ability to supply? And maybe you could address that across the board, whether it was unwillingness to purchase Ukrainian grain or an inability to supply to the market.
Thank you for the question. I would say that was both, but probably more not willingness to buy from Ukraine because they're having so tight now connections with Russia. And actually another interesting development here that China started to buy corn from Brazil that they never did. And this is also some geopolitical game, because if I don't have this today on my slide, but I always do some information about the diversification of Russian export of grain. And now on those, and that structure, you can see Mexico and Brazil, Argentina. That was not an issue before the war. So Russia started to, try to have more power on Latin American countries that is next to you, that you need to think about as well. But yeah, China, first of all, that was started with the problems with logistics, but then also, they have border with Russia, and they can, without any problems, get anything, avoiding all such sanctions through the land borders with Russia. So, however, that is not the situation with corn, because Russia is not a big exporter of corn. They do not produce enough. So that's why China switched to Brazil. Yeah.
Other questions for our panel? All right, well, I will ask you a question. Oh, is there one? I'm sorry, I didn't see hands. We have microphone coming.
Just a brief question on the mining, like the mines, is that purely Russian mines, or are there any Ukrainian mines? And maybe that's just my own ignorance, but clarification.
Sure. So when we think about environmental damage, that's why we try to break it down, what's happening intentionally, what's going to happen as a byproduct. There will be, I would say, in terms of the presentation we just had, agricultural land, I would not expect to see a lot of Ukrainian defensive mining in areas that they also know are so important for their economy. So there will be some issues with demining, perhaps along Ukraine defensive fortifications. The difference there is that Ukraine will keep, I'm sure, very good records of where they're doing that. And so the element of also needing to both find and then diffuse these mines on the Russian side is quite different. The other thing that we've seen, you have to expend some effort to get Ukraine, right, to be the largest mined country in the world. That's I think it's important that we stop and think about how much effort Russia is expending to do things like that. You don't do that by accident. So the level of intentional mining in areas both where people live, where farmers live, and for as a sort of industrial weapon of terror is a sort of qualitative and quantitative difference there between the sides.
I have a urban planning, city planning specific coming from a city planning perspective, like you mentioned, with regard to grains and getting product to market. Can you guys share anything about the issues with the supply chains and the transportation routes that have been affected throughout the war area, to the war area, from the war area, and how maybe the military aspects of this war affected the transportation routes and getting product to market?
I can take this question. So, of course, all infrastructure has been partially damaged. I mean, roads, railroads, as if from the top of my head, had around 285,000 kilometers of roads were destroyed. Over 350 bridges were destroyed in Ukraine. And of course, the supply chain been interrupted both internally and abroad. And today, it was mentioned actually yesterday that Ukraine now became one of the food insecure country. I cannot totally agree with this, because we still are able to produce and feed ourselves and feed the rest of the world. But the supply chain to those areas that are more close to the active hostilities, to the front line, is really complicated, and not many, let's say, even drivers want to go there, right, on their trucks to bring food to people. When Kakhovka was destroyed. People didn't have even water, right, to drink. When Kherson was liberated, first thing that my husband did, he traveled with his friends, bringing people water, portable stove with propane to cook just at least hot food, right? And it means that those people are really suffering with having good food and nutrition food. And talking about production there, of course, they have limited supply with fertilizers, fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So supply chain, for especially that region, is interrupted, but also for others. Like we still don't have enough fertilizers for the rest of the territory, right, to apply. And this can cause decrease of fertility of our rich soil.
And maybe I'll just add one other point that I think I was thinking about while you were talking, Antonina, and your past experience in the former Yugoslavia, Kurt. You know, as humans adapt the environment to be very nerdy and technical, we call it, you know, the construction of the niche. So the environment is changing people as people are also changing the environment. When you have a major disruptor, whether it's markets and the way that they're changing, or whether it's some of this urban, like your question was about urban planning, my question that is still an outstanding question for me is culturally and socially, what is Ukraine going to look like? And so just to tie that specifically with urban planning, you know, I did just get back from Ukraine about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And some of what I was doing there was focus groups with people who've been displaced. What are they with the communities they live in now? And I have to say, like, to Ukraine's enormous credit, both the people having to be in new places like that were culturally different to them, and the people receiving them are really impressive and trying to work together and come together. And there are a lot of these conversations about what should our cities look like. And so, for example, you know, I lived in Kyiv, lots and lots of high rises. Now it's no longer exactly like, it doesn't feel quite right to live on like the 17th floor of a high rise, right? Because if the power's out, you've got 17 flights of stairs to go up. Or, you know, everybody
target for
exactly thinking about the drones and the missiles. And so we're almost like, you know, in black humor, like having these conversations in Ukraine about all the businesses in Kyiv that had parking garages are like actually doing quite well because they're converting the parking garages. Or the sort of very interesting ones to me are what the nightclub scenes in Ukraine's did. So a lot of those nightclubs, because of the curfews, can't be nightclubs. So there are actually some great co-working spaces that the nightclubs have turned into, right? And so the way that within the environment and what we call the built environment are changing and adapting in people's minds, you know, I think that some of this is going to be similar to what we remember before, but then also very different, both with the market and the way that people interact with the environment and the type of built environment landscape that they want in the future.
Spoken like an anthropologist, I might say.
I revealed my cards.
Underground schools.
That's right.
Your comment, so from an agricultural employment labor force, right? And agriculture is generational, right? So if you lose lots of agricultural workers, what impact does that have in Ukraine?
Yeah, employment gonna be a big issue now for Ukraine for several reasons. First, a lot of young people, women, young generation like me with children, we left Ukraine, and I don't know how soon I will be able to return, right? And this is labor. A lot of people probably will assimilate, will adjust to new environment, and will never return. So we are losing young generation. Another issue, a lot of workers, farmers, they serve for militaries, right? And they return to their field literally when they can, when they have few days to plant, and it means that vegetation calendar is not following, right? And this means losses in harvest, in yields. And another issue, of course, a lot of men were killed, right, in a war. And in this situation, women gonna take that initiative. We have a lot women farmers in Ukraine, and we had this before the war, but I think after the war that will be a challenge, and they will need to take this initiative in their hands. That is a problem, not only for agriculture, actually, for other industries as well.
Now, I happen to know there are several students in the room and y'all are being shy. Just because you're in the back of the room doesn't mean we don't know you're here. So I would encourage if we have any questions from students. Suddenly they're all looking down.
Actually, yeah, Riley, go ahead.
Sorry, it was mentioned the destruction of agricultural equipment during this. Is that like a direct attack on agricultural equipment, or is that more like a lateral thing? Is it both?
That is both. A lot of farms were destroyed from missile strikes, and a lot of equipment was just stolen. Just literally combined tractors and some other equipment was taken from Ukrainian territory to Russian territory or remain on occupied territories, and Ukrainian farmers are forced to continue work and harvest crops. And according to the latest census data from NASA Harvest, at least 7 million tons of wheat were harvested on occupied territories. And this increases actually share of Russia in on a global wheat market. I would like to mention that last year, before the war, the share of Russia on the international wheat market was around 16%. In 2024, it's going to be almost 25%. So you need to understand that having a quarter of the wheat market in their hand, it's very easy to manipulate with prices and shortage of grain, of wheat, which is bread, right, on the market. And this is really how they use food as a weapon for import-dependent countries.
I think it's also a good opportunity to talk about how repetitive some of the cycle of violence has been, because, you know, I studied the Ukrainian Holodomor in the 1930s, and what we saw was a very similar pattern of destruction. Everything that was carried away and things that weren't able to be carried away, particularly farming equipment, was destroyed. And so, you know, this broader conversation of cycles of violence and what needs to be done to disrupt them, as I think the general and our other panel was talking about, also relates very specifically and concretely to your point about the equipment.
We have a question up here from the radical middle. Okay.
Of the connection of national genocide via is there thinking right now about making breakthroughs in terms of how to connect security, national security, to setting up food and water infrastructures? Because we've seen, you know, food being used to weapon historically, potato famine here in the United States, bison used as a military weapon to defeat the Native Americans rather than have to wipe them out all the way. So is there a place actually to restore potential soft power, State Department, the Pentagon, to turn the Pentagon actually into a dynamo of soft power in terms of building use of things like holistic design, permaculture, these kinds of ideas? And may Ukraine have a place in terms of setting up things like silvopasture systems, perennial agriculture? Here in Kansas, we have the Land Institute that's researching all that. Are those kinds of ideas on the table, or should they be?
Yeah, I can take a. So I would say, and I'll go back to Indo-PACOM for a moment, is that from a soft power perspective, recently hosted an international meeting that of militaries, principally, you know, security on illegal fishing, for example. There's also previous to that, there's been meetings on invasive species, which in the Pacific Basin is a enormously important topic. Yeah, in particular, and I know this, it sounds like a cartoon, but it's actually a very serious issue, is the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which impacts, literally destroys the coconut economy. And so control, discussions between, on biosecurity issues associated with invasive species. That's the kind of soft power discussions that the Department of Defense, and particularly kind of hats off to Indo-PACOM, have on a recurring basis. It's an issue for us. We have an enormous logistics system and requirements, and it's important, in particular with invasive species, it's important that we not inadvertently land an invasive species on the island nation. There's no better way to, ruin a relationship.
And we still have a question in the back.
Thank you so much. So a very specific question, but very small. I was just wondering about land ownership structure and how do you foresee that changing in the future, and what would the effects sort of on smallholder agriculture versus other industrial complexes and all that sort of land rights issue really is interesting to me. So I would love to hear some insights.
Thank you, Vera.
Okay. So, I don't know how much you're familiar with, but after USSR collapse, of course, during the USSR time, we had agricultural, those collective farms, huge farms, and after USSR collapse, we had privatization process, and a lot of farmers kind of got plots that they were able to continue cultivate them together, or some of them took that land and organized their private farms. But since then, till 2021, it was moratorium on land market that were not, we didn't sell agricultural land. And just at the end of 2021, the land market was open, and that was very short time, right, before beginning of the war, that this market started to operate well. And one of our biggest concern why we had that moratorium, that is actually we were afraid that since our land is so rich, that foreigners will come, right, and buy our land, especially Russians, right? We didn't want that. So now our land market started to operate, and there are some deals that happen that selling and buying, but there are some limitations how much you can buy. I don't want to lie to you and tell some wrong numbers, but there is a law how much hectares of land you can buy in a time, or 20,000. Thank you. Yeah, so that is kind of limits and prevent that those huge, large corporations will take over and will take advantage of little farmers.
Okay, I think we're done here. That is it for our panel. If you would please give another round of applause to our speakers, that would be great.